Brilliant. I'll tell you what, not only does Lance set you up extremely well to fall on your face for any talks, and I think a few of us have seen that today, but he also sets you up extremely well in terms of what we have here as a community and what we've heard here. So I've really enjoyed the fact that I've listened to so many fantastic talks, either here or indeed looking at what's going on in Slack, or indeed, of course, diving into the other room in order to hear what's being said on screens, and just seeing so much really great content. So much so that not only getting the opportunity to have a share with you about some of the things we're going to cover, but also doing it after lunch feels even doubly cruel. However, as Lance suggested, I have come from slightly further afield than I suspect most people have today, and you can probably tell that by the funny way that I speak. And as you heard, I am Alashe. I head up a team at CybSafe, a software company, a cybersecurity and data analytics company that is literally focused on this issue of influencing and measuring security behaviors, because of course, as I'm going to talk to you, security behaviors are such a key component if we're serious about addressing human risk. So I kind of want to build on a bit of a theme that I think is already being discussed here, and I'm almost certain is going to get discussed quite a lot as we continue through these next couple of days. And if you'll bear with me, I'm going to do it really explaining and giving an update to some of you on some research that's been taking place globally. We're really fortunate, actually, like I said, I'm based in the UK, but actually the work and the thinking that we do and the teams that we work with are global. And at CybSafe, our focus really is on how we get users to actually change their security behaviors. But more importantly, how do we do that in a way that means that we know what we're doing is working? Because actually, if you think about it, sometimes we do things that work, and sometimes we do things that don't work. And if you can't tell the difference between the two, then you can't do very much about it. Somebody stood up on stage and said, I sometimes disagree with Lance. And I thought, gosh, that's a big, bold statement. And then Lance said something, and I thought, I don't agree with that. And here's the thing that I thought, actually, which I think is important, and I suspect Lance would agree with this. I'm not convinced that actually, in order to change behavior, you need to get people to listen to you. Somebody stood up on stage earlier on and said, actually, if you want to get people to listen to change behavior, and it wasn't actually Lance, it was somebody else, you need to get to listen to you, but that's not true. If you're a bloke in the room, and I think hopefully you'll understand that colloquialism, if you're a bloke in the room, you will recognize the fly on the urinal. Stick your hand up if you know what I'm talking about, the fly on the urinal. No? Let me explain a bit further. And if you're a bloke in the room, I should probably explain that. That means if you're a man. And the fly on the urinal is in the men's loos, in a number of places, in the urinal, there's a fly. It's actually a printed fly. It's not a real fly, which you'll be glad to know, but it's a printed fly. And it was put on the urinal because somebody somewhere worked out. Sorry, the urinal. You guys don't know what to about the urinal. Everyone's like, what's that medical thing he's on about? No, urinal, the place that you go to relieve oneself. If anyone is like me and you went to the loo earlier on, I noticed that we've got those kind of loos over here that are so far away that by the time you get back, you need to go again. Has anybody else had that experience? So the urinal, so the fly on the urinal basically encourages men to point in the right direction. Saves cleaning, tidying, and all sorts of other stuff. No one told them what to do. Nobody engaged them, or us. It's different. We heard from Cassie earlier on, brilliant talk and presentation, talking about moving vegetables to the beginning of the queue. No engagement, no communication, no telling people what to do. You don't need to do those things to change behaviors. That's not to say that you shouldn't do them. That's not to say that you might not need to do them. My point is that's not the only way you can influence security behaviors. And so this is really important because as a community, one of the things that is happening at the moment is a maturity and an evolution that is extremely exciting. Somebody in our team at CybSafe described it as a beautiful shift. There is a beautiful shift that's underway. And actually, I would suggest that this summit reflects so much of that beautiful shift throughout many of these conversations. The shift that I'm going to focus on, though, is the one that says, and we've heard it a little bit now, moving from training, entertaining, and tricking to focusing on measuring and influencing security behaviors. Somebody, and it's deliberately provocative, somebody will quite rightly say, well, actually, the training and the entertaining and the tricking is all about security behaviors. And of course, to a degree, that's true. But what I really want to encourage, and I guess the kind of takeaway up front is, I'd like us to reverse the way we think about this. And for those of you who've been looking and thinking about behavior change for some time, you'll be aware that actually starting at the end is the way to achieve the aim. So if you're serious and interested in security behaviors, serious about them and interested in them, then starting at the end is the way. So this is a shift that is taking place, and we're going to talk about it a bit more. Again, maybe again, sticking my neck out, as you have a tendency to do when you're further away from home than maybe you are normally. If you are not influencing security behaviors, then you're not having any impact on the risk of your organization. No matter what you're doing, if it's not influencing security behaviors, it's not having any impact on the risk of your organization. If you are increasing the amount of knowledge that people have, but it's not influencing security behaviors, it's having no impact. If you've got loads of people giving you really great feedback and enjoying what you've done for them, if they are laughing immensely, if they remember every single thing that you told them, but it doesn't influence their security behaviors, you're not impacting any risk. And so if you consider the fact that, as we've heard, managing human risk is the business that we're all in, actually, it gives us a nice, simple lens with which to consider something that is not at all simple and not at all easy to do, but extremely important. The word behaviors, even if it is slightly spelt incorrectly on this slide, the word behaviors, sorry, a reference that some of you will no doubt get, is of course extremely important. And of course, security behaviors are even more specific. And we're not the first people to think about influencing and changing behaviors. My watch tells me when to stand up if I've been sat down for too long. Many of you will have all sorts of other tools and aids that you rely on daily that help you. If you're like me, getting up this morning, you needed something to nudge me, an alarm clock. Nobody educated me about it. I know exactly what to do, and no one ever taught me about that particular thing. And so this is really normal for us, but interestingly, as a security community, it's one of the really exciting evolutions that we are now starting to understand and apply really effectively. Some of you will be aware that very recently, literally I think in the last month, maybe even the last few weeks, NIST has published a piece of research. At CybSafe, we're pretty obsessed about research. And indeed, one of the things we like the most about this community is we share so much of it so widely. And so whether it's white papers and ebooks or indeed research papers like this, there is so much information out there, and so much of it is now referring to and talking about security behaviors so effectively. NIST's research was looking very specifically at measuring the effectiveness of US government security awareness programs. And of course, even though they were focused on US government security awareness programs, if you get a chance to have a look at this research report, which this is actually one part of a big, broad range of research series, you'll see how reflective this is of the industry and the community writ large. Interestingly, they looked at and asked a number of different questions. They basically asked the research respondents, how do you measure the effectiveness of your programs? What are you trying to achieve with your programs? And what stops you measuring the effectiveness of those programs? And they got a whole range of answers. And the data is absolutely fascinating. What NIST actually called out in their research is, one, not only does everybody kind of collectively agree that security behaviors are the ultimate aim, but lots of people actually collectively agree that they don't know how to measure them. They don't even know where to start. And indeed, as we've heard from a few people, where they do know about behaviors, they're focused very narrowly on a small set of behaviors rather than the bigger, broader set of behaviors they could be focused on. They acknowledge the importance of compliance and the measurement associated with compliance. And of course, as we've discussed, and indeed we'll continue to hear, the importance of knowledge and the importance of understanding and attitudes and decisions. But they ultimately said, as you can see in the quote on the right-hand side, it's about security behaviors. On the right as you're looking at it, it's about security behaviors. And so ultimately, if you're not able to bring this all together as it relates to security behaviors, then the question is, how can you see what impact? So much so that NIST has then said that they're going to change their guidance because they believe they can give more guidance and help people understand how they can take steps towards this. This is a big step. This is a big step. Forrester are about to release a report. I believe that the report has looked at a range of the standards and regulatory requirements as they relate to security awareness. And they're about to state and show basically that quite a few of them have not been updated for anything between 12 and 17 years. 12 and 17 years. We've learned a lot as a community about not just, of course, managing human risk, but the various components of managing human risk. And so there's quite a lot of updating to take place. And it's really interesting to see people like NIST do that. It's worth calling out upfront that the reason we're talking about this is because quite often, and this is not just, again, unique to security, this is something that happens in lots of different parts of lots of different fields where people are looking at security behaviors, people go straight to the solution. The solution must be that we must get people to enjoy it, right? Or the solution must be that we must increase understanding, right? Or the solution must be that we need to get people to pay more attention to security, right? Without actually thinking about the reason why the thing is not happening in the first place. And again, within the research community, focusing very specifically and being very clear about the problem that you're trying to address, and then understanding the various components, which in our particular case, you need to really understand and be quite specific about the behavior that you want to change. And then, and only then, looking at the various interventions is a really tried and tested way of being effective in this space. So I spoke to a few of you, and indeed many more people, and I know there's some people listening, about 2 and a bit years ago, and told you about the Security Behaviour Database, CybDB, which was a research project, and it was referred to by at least one of the other speakers earlier on. It was a research project that we rather naively at CybSafe thought, well, we're trying to build a behavioral framework model because ultimately what we want to do is provide effective interventions that get better and improve over time. And we want to be able to predict the likelihood of certain types of risks in the future, et cetera, et cetera. So we had to catalog every security behavior, and we thought we could do that ourselves within 3 or 4 months. It turned out that, guess what, 25 people can't do that. And even though now the company is 100 people, at the time then we were only 25 people. So the fact is we couldn't do it by ourselves. The other thing that we worked out was actually we needed the bigger, broader community to look at this. And so we ended up with an open source research project that has involved hundreds of security professionals from a variety of different countries to catalog every single security behavior and relate it to risk outcomes. So what that means is there's now an open source resource that literally says, if this is the risk outcome that you're trying to avoid, here are the security behaviors that relate to those risk outcomes, and here's the evidence for that. And here's some of the other data that's associated with those security behaviors. And this thing, the Security Behaviour Database, known lovingly as CybDB, has then been used by a variety of organizations. Hundreds of organizations, if not more now, around the globe, who are literally able to now say, oh, well, we're really interested in malware, or indeed identity theft, or actually what we're really trying to avoid is fraud. And therefore, these are the security behaviors. Those of you who know anything about security behaviors will be aware, especially if you've met any of the scientists in our team, Dr. John Blythe, Dr. Jason Nurse. John has moved on, but he was one of the instrumental people behind this at the time, that be aware that behaviors don't happen in isolation. Behaviors happen as a system. The behaviors that you exhibit will be determined by not just your own understanding, knowledge, motivations, but actually the behaviors of other people around you, or maybe even some of the external factors associated with the environment that you're in. So it's a behavioral system, actually, that you need to think about. But what that gives us are opportunities. Within the database, we've cataloged not just the security behaviors, but also the spillover effect, the likelihood that behavior A affects behavior B, which now starts to give you the opportunity to work out where the low-hanging fruit might be if you're thinking about addressing certain security behaviors. One of the other things that we found extremely useful, especially when you start to look at and take into account the sample data, is the fact that actually some of the behaviors that you think about might be quite hard to move or impact are actually less so depending on the circumstance. This kind of likelihood of change, ease of change, is key, and I'll come back to why that's the case in a minute. So understanding what the behaviors are, the problem is, understanding the relevant behaviors, and then understanding what is influencing those target behaviors is key, as we said earlier on. So is also this idea of understanding the outcome that you're trying to avoid. This is where I think, as a community, we are really now starting to have an incredible opportunity. Understanding the outcomes that you're trying to avoid. We spend a lot of time talking to people who ask us questions like, how do we get other members, either just within the security team or within the broader organization, to take this seriously? And of course, and I think somebody asked a question of one of the speakers earlier on, some of the answers are, well, show them the data, help them understand the impact on the things that they care about. And of course, when we start talking about risk outcomes, data leakage, account compromise, data theft, malware infection, these are really clear things that other members of the security team are also equally keen, in fact, working quite hard to ensure that they avoid. So to be able to make sure that we explain how what we do fits into that is key, and security behaviors are a fantastic way in which we can do that, and a really obvious way in which we can address it. Prioritizing the behaviors is hard. If you look at the Security Behaviour Database, there are actually something like 79 security behaviors in there today. 79 individual security behaviors that have each been catalogued and related to risk outcomes. Actually, earlier on, you would have heard me say we've catalogued every single security behavior, but the reality is, of course, it's a live list. This community, and indeed a bigger, broader subset, including many of the people who are listening on screens and watching this virtually, have contributed and constantly contribute to this. If you take phishing alone has a variety of behaviors, some of which you know extremely well. Clicking and reporting are two separate security behaviors. But actually, if phishing is really the issue that you're looking to address, you might choose to address whether people have addressed their privacy settings on their social media accounts. You might choose to look at whether people are reusing their credentials, particularly their work credentials, email addresses on non-email things. All of these things are security behaviors that contribute to the challenge of phishing your organizations have, but quite often we laser in to, did this person report the phishing email, or did this person click on the link in the simulated phishing? I share this not because what we're doing is not worthwhile, I just share it because there is so much more, and there is a beautiful shift that is underway. And we have an opportunity to lean into that more. So when it comes to prioritizing it, it's key because, as we keep hearing, our teams aren't big enough, and they're paid $30,000 less than they should be. But I love the fact that there's now a bunch of CISOs all around the world pissed off with Lance. I love that. I love that. And so we do need to prioritize. Of course we do. Not just because we don't have the resource. We need to prioritize because here's the truth. It's not all that important. Or it's not all as important as each other. And so it doesn't make sense to be spending time focused on things that aren't that important. And this is something, again, as a community that we're evolving in our thinking and in our articulation. If we say that everything is as important as each other, if we genuinely believe that everybody needs to know everything, we won't be believed, we won't be that useful, and we won't be that impactful. So being able to choose and be clear about what is and prioritize makes a significant difference. I touched on spillover, I've touched on suitability, I've also touched on ease of measurement. And indeed, for those who are interested, I can provide some additional resources. I'll definitely stick it in Slack that helps explain the different ways in which you can measure. There's actually 6 that we focus on, ways of measuring security behaviors, some of which look at objective measures, proximate measures, self-report, 360 feedback. There's a whole different way, and we've got an ebook that outlines all of these things and how you can do some of them, many of them yourself without any additional support or external support, and of course, how you can lean into that support if you want to. But prioritizing behaviors is key. Back to the Security Behaviour Database. It's a live database. So that means actually one of the things that's really exciting about it is as this space evolves and develops, and as the risk, or more importantly, the threats evolve, we can evolve our understanding and share that understanding together as a community. Now, I've just done something that I will come back to in a second. I talked about threat and I've talked about risk, and I think I probably mentioned the word vulnerability at some point earlier on as well. And it's important that even there we start to get tidier with our language, and I'm going to pick up exactly why that's important, specifically for this community right now in a second. In the database, you can be really explicit about the risk outcomes that you want to avoid. And it's all open and free for use. Malware infection, most of us as organizations want to avoid those. Which specific behaviors are important and relevant for malware infection? Why is that the case? And which ones relate to other things? And indeed, where are the case studies and examples? Word of caution, we had an attempt at prioritizing security behaviors based on the input from things like the NIST guidance, ENISA guidance, the UK National Cybersecurity Centre's guidance, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is, as we've learned over time, many organizations prioritize themselves. The priorities are actually quite useful and important when it comes to scoring and metrics. And actually, one of the other things that we're doing at CybSafe and have spent a lot of time focused on is looking at how you would score and quantify many of these risks. And I'm going to share with you where our thinking is at the moment. But that point about likelihood of change, how likely is it that if you focus on a specific behavior with a specific set of interventions, you will actually affect it? That's key, and of course, can only really be answered based on data. So the research that went into putting behind the Security Behaviour Database for each of the behaviors looked at data sets of between 2,000 and 5,000 people, depending on the security behavior and depending on the risk outcome. It's a great start point, but more importantly, it's one that we want to evolve with this community. So the last 2 years is really about evolving this rapidly. Now, I touched on the interplay between risk, threat, and vulnerability. And I did so because we talk about it so much as a community. The broader security community, of course, understands this very well. Many of you in this room, this is your bread and butter that you live. But interestingly, when you look at the security community, the aspect of the security community, or the element of the security community that sometimes doesn't fully grasp the difference between these terms, is often those of us who manage human risk. Security behaviors makes it really much more simple for us to articulate what we do in the context of threats, risks, and vulnerabilities. I think everybody in this room, well, let me flag. I suspect lots of people in this room are really comfortable with these definitions, but it is worth noting that actually, whether we're talking about the risk itself, so the potential for damage rather than actual damage, or whether we're talking about risk outcomes, which I've referred to a lot, which is, of course, the result, should that potential come to pass, of something actually happening, or the vulnerability, which is a weakness that can be exploited. And of course, in the context of security behaviors are a potential vulnerability or a potential strength, or whether we're talking about the threat, which of course is the thing that might exploit a vulnerability. It's really important that we're clear about that language, because if we blur the language, we make it difficult to articulate the impact that we're having on the organization. Let me say that again. Being really explicit about the security behaviors that you're impacting, therefore the vulnerability that you're addressing, makes it much cleaner and clearer for you to articulate the impact you're having on your organization. If anybody wants, we can definitely do this later on, because I suspect we won't have time today. I can explain this all, or give you a way of explaining this using houses, burglars, water damage, and cats. Houses, burglars, water damage, and cats. Very, very quickly, most of you will be aware that, of course, if you have a house and you leave a key in the door, that might be a behavior that's not ideal, a potential vulnerability. But it really depends on what the threat is in your area. If you don't live anywhere where there are any burglars, then the risk is actually probably quite low. The likelihood of something bad happening is low. The impact, if it did happen, probably quite high, especially if the outcome you want to avoid is having your house burgled. If the outcome that you want to avoid is actually your house being flooded, then leaving a key in the door isn't that much of an issue, but leaving a window open potentially is. Leaving a window open is just as important for having your house burgled and for having your house flooded, but only if you live in a place where it's raining or likely to rain, or in a place where the burglars can get up to those windows. You get there's an interplay between risks, threats, and vulnerabilities that we often miss. And as I've suggested to you, simplifying this within the context of security behaviors makes it now really clear the impact you have on your organization, but also helps you prioritize which things you should be focused on. This is one of the things that we think, and like I said, I can give you some stuff to explain this if helpful later. The juicy bits. Actually, by doing this, by breaking down the security behaviors and relating them to risk outcomes, and being really clear about the risk outcomes that you're likely to impact, and more importantly, the security behaviors that are likely to have the impact on those behaviors, you now start to be able to quantify things in a really interesting way. Here are some definitions that we have worked on, that we use within the CybSafe platform, but the fact of the matter is, ultimately, you can apply your own, and we offer these just as starters for 10 for anybody who is looking to do this really quickly. Security behaviors, and indeed the security behavior impact score, relates very specifically to risk outcomes. As I said to you, the key in the door doesn't impact the different outcomes in the same way. Somebody's going to say to me, what's the relevance of the cats later on, but you'll have to speak to me about that another time. The security behavior probability score, of course, means that the probability of that thing happening and the impact on the outcome is one aspect of the risk that you might carry. And of course, the impact and the probability multiplied together give you the risk score that is quite useful for you then. And it's the risk scores aggregated up for each of the specific outcomes or each of the specific behaviors that then start to help you understand how likely is it that your organization is going to fall victim to malware infection, identity theft, data leakage, or any other risk outcome that you're trying to avoid. These are really interesting ways of now starting to quantify, and we've started to see, we haven't got enough data yet to be able to see over time the impact, but we've started to see organizations start to speak really clearly about, we ran these programs, we impacted these 3, 4, 2 security behaviors. Notice I use really low numbers. Another mistake we make as a community is the idea that we would impact tens of security behaviors, and you won't, not well. And if you do, you won't know what you're doing to impact them. So narrowing it down is really key, and then building over time. We ran these programs, we ran these initiatives, we impacted these behaviors, and in impacting these behaviors, we had this effect against the organization's objectives. Using the Security Behaviour Database, a free open source database that has been contributed to by many of you in this room, and indeed many, many more people who are listening, and many, many more people who are probably asleep somewhere in the world. The fact is, you can then iterate and develop and evolve over time. And we'll do that together as a community. There is more to come. Actually, we haven't talked about now, but I know that people are talking in other talks about the variety of data sources that you could turn to for security behaviors. I've mentioned that there's at least 6 different ways that you can measure security behaviors. You can go to some of the systems that you have, indeed for objective measures, in order to pull that data out of the things and the tools that people use every day. You can use self-report, because actually, despite the fact that it's self-report, it's what somebody says, depending on the way that you ask the question, and indeed if you do it scientifically, it's actually extraordinarily accurate. And again, I can share with you the white papers that demonstrate that. You can use 360 feedback. You can effectively get other people to report, which is another aspect on the security behaviors of individuals. You can, of course, use observatory or observation measures to see it. So what do you actually watch? There are several other ways in which you can do it. But ultimately, increasing those metrics is absolutely key. And doing so in a framework that means you can map it to risk is even more important. There are behavioral insights across our community that aren't yet being shared. So one of the things that has really excited us and we're kind of been having it sent to us, we need to make sure that it's made even more readily available, are people saying, we have focused on these specific behaviors, and we've seen this that's worked and this that hasn't worked. That is great information for us to share amongst ourselves. We're really interested in addressing and trying to get people to change the default password on their Wi-Fi router at home. And because of some of the work that's been done, we've seen organizations have a 47 to 67% increase in the number of people who change the default password on the Wi-Fi router at home, which, by the way, actually the thing that impacts that the most, from what we can see, is literally reminding people at the right time, not teaching them about it, not making sure that they know to do it, but literally reminding them at the right time. Nudges and prompts that mean that actually you can save yourself a whole lot of work and a whole lot of time. So getting that information out there in the behavioral insights is something that as a community we'll do and make sure, and indeed thank you everybody who's been contributing to that. And then actually the question that's been asked constantly is, are there anything that's specific to industries or to roles when it comes to security behaviors? And the reality is we don't yet have the data to suggest that there are for industries, but we are starting to see data as it relates to roles. And we'll make sure that all of that goes into the database. This is key. This is something that we've got to do because actually the reality is, as a community, we need to share this information. So my takeaways are really just threefold. Be specific about the security behaviors that you're focused on. We are often talking about security behaviors, but the truth is quite often we're generalizing or lumping so many of them together. Be specific about the security behaviors. Influence those specific security behaviors. If you're not influencing the security behaviors, you're not impacting the risk that your organization carries. No matter how much people know, no matter how much people can recite, no matter how much people are engaged, or no matter how interested people are, if they don't influence the security behavior, you're not impacting the risk your organization carries. And then, of course, measure. And hopefully what I've hopefully showed you is there are ways to measure security behaviors that probably are right within your grasp immediately, and really happy to share more about those later. That's it. That's it. Hopefully helpful. Again, like I said, sorry for speaking too fast. There we go.